Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. Special Counsel Robert Mueller will finally be testifying before Congress this month. Democrats are clearly hoping he'll drop a bombshell. Republicans are planning to attack Mueller in order to delegitimize his investigation. Both sides are probably doing it wrong. For this edition of Other Voices, we'll take a look at the Mueller report itself and learn what to expect and what not to expect when Mueller testifies to Congress. To help us do that, I'm pleased to welcome David SLOSS, Professor of Law at Santa Clara University School of Law. David is an internationally renowned scholar with expertise in constitutional law, international law, and criminal law. He has published 3 books and several dozen law review articles on a wide variety of legal and public policy topics. And he recently published an op-ed piece titled Prosecuting a President for Obstruction of Justice. I'm going to talk to him about that. David, welcome to Other Voices.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us here. Let's start with, go back to the beginning. Part of, as I mentioned in the intro, the Republicans are clearly have a plan to try to delegitimize the Mueller investigation by going all the way back to when the Russia investigation started during the election campaign.
Right.
Of course, Robert Mueller wasn't around then. So let's remind ourselves how Robert Mueller came to do this investigation and why and what he was supposed to do.
Right. Well, he was appointed by the Attorney General as special counsel, essentially to investigate Russian interference in the U.S. election in 2016 and determine whether criminal charges could be brought against people associated with that.
Okay, and that didn't start until it was May of 2017, was it?
That sounds right. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not good with dates either. And I'm going to assume that you've read the report.
Yes.
What do you make of Attorney General Barr's summary of the report that was delivered well before anybody got to read it?
Right.
And your own reading of the report?
Well, so it's interesting. The Attorney General Barr sent his letter to Congress on March 24th of this year, summarizing the report. 3 days later, Mueller sent a memo to Barr saying, in effect, that he thought Barr had gotten some of it wrong. Right?
Yes. He was being very polite.
He was being very diplomatic, but that was the sort of gist of it. And I think the biggest difference between what's in the report and what's in Barr's summary of the report relates to obstruction of justice, where Barr basically reached a conclusion that the president did not obstruct justice. And Mueller very carefully avoided reaching that conclusion.
Yeah. When we talk about that section of the report, I want to return to that conflict between Barr and Mueller and what they did. So the Mueller report itself is broken down into 2 volumes. One is about the investigation into Russian hacking and contacts with the campaign. And then volume 2 is the investigation into possible obstruction of justice. So let's just go through the report in that order. He picked that structure. Who am I going to argue with it? So, and the first part is on social media and how the report was, or how the Russians used social media to attack our elections.
Well, so I'd say the first part deals a little more broadly with Russian interference. So Mueller says in his summary that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election in, I think he uses the term, in sweeping and systematic fashion.
Sweeping and systematic fashion, yes.
And he says that basically the interference basically sort of falls into 2 categories. One category, this is my term, not his, involves hacking and dumping, and the second category involves social media. So the hacking and dumping is they hacked into the servers of the Democratic National Committee, collected a whole bunch of information, and then sort of strategically released that information at different points during the campaign at times that seem to be, calculated to sort of influence the direction of the campaign and influence public opinion. That's the sort of hacking and dumping piece. And then separate from that, they had a whole very active social media operation. And the Mueller report, they were operating thousands of different social media accounts on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on YouTube. And the Mueller report basically says that they reached well over 100 million Americans through their social media operation.
I've bought advertising on Facebook, and it's never paid off. I'll have to go talk to some Russians. One of the things that I think rarely gets mentioned that caught my eye in the report is that the Russians actually started this project in 2014.
Yeah, maybe even earlier, maybe as far back as 2012, 2013. But they then started gearing up more later.
When we got into 2016, they kind of picked out Donald Trump from the lineup and said, he's our guy. And they started adjusting this whole campaign that they'd been working on.
Yeah, so the U.S. intelligence community issued a report on this in January 2017, shortly after the election. And they identified a couple of critical goals of the Russian operation. But one of the goals of the Russian operation was essentially to support Donald Trump and disparage Hillary Clinton. And they were pretty successful in doing that.
Yes. They had a couple of easy targets both ways, didn't they? So at what point, let me ask you this. Have you seen any studies that try to get at quantifying the effect on the election?
It's very hard to quantify the effect on the election. The most interesting thing I've seen, which I just came across actually yesterday, does a correlation that looks at the volume of, they just look at Russian activity on Twitter, and they look at the amount of likes and retweets on Twitter, and they correlate that with changes in public opinion polling data week to week. And there seems to be a correlation that when there's a high spike in activity of likes and retweets of Russian posts on Twitter, the public opinion polls go up in favor of Donald Trump. They don't claim that there's causality there, but it's certainly consistent with a thesis of causality. There is no correlation there with what happens with Hillary, according to this study at least. No correlation what happens with Hillary Clinton's poll numbers, but there is a correlation here that when there's a lot of activity on Twitter, the poll numbers in favor of Trump go up.
No wonder he likes Twitter so much. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and just this past week we had former President Jimmy Carter stating pretty clearly that he thinks it did have a clear impact and helped elect Donald Trump.
There are other people who have said that. I think it's hard to come up with sort of really rigorous social science analysis in support of that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's also impossible to come up with rigorous social science analysis that says it didn't happen, right? That it didn't have an effect on the election. And that itself should be troubling to us, in my opinion.
That's right. That's quite right. And then another part of this Russia aspect of the investigation has to do with all the contacts between Russian operatives of some sort or other and various people with the Trump campaign.
Right, right.
What was 130 contacts or something like that?
I don't remember the precise number,
Over
but there
100.
was very extensive contacts between the Trump campaign and various Russian nationals, some of whom more closely associated with the Russian government, some of whom a little more distant, right? And one of the things that that the Mueller team looked at very closely was, is there evidence here to support a charge of conspiracy, right? A lot of the public talk is about collusion. Collusion is not a sort of defined legal term, but conspiracy is a defined legal term.
How did that term become so popular if it is not a legal term?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think Donald Trump himself had a lot to do with that, right? That he just kept saying, no collusion, no
yes.
collusion.
He
right?
still is, tweeting about no collusion this morning.
Right. But the Mueller investigation looked specifically at, is there sufficient evidence here to support a charge of conspiracy? Conspiracy is a defined crime, and it basically involves an agreement between two parties to engage in illegal activity. And what he found, and this is really important, so in this part of the report, Mueller is approaching this as a prosecutor. And as a prosecutor, in order to say that, we have evidence here of conspiracy, he's got to be able to say, I think I can prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. And the conclusion he reaches in this part of the report is there's not enough evidence here to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, that's very different from saying there was no conspiracy.
Right.
He never comes out and says there was no conspiracy. All he says is, I don't have enough evidence to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. And one of the interesting things here is there's a very good blog post I read about a week or two ago that pointed out that, there's so much evidence here of obstruction of justice, which we'll get back and talk about in a minute, right?
Yeah.
It's quite possible if there hadn't been obstruction of justice, there might have been sufficient evidence to be able to actually support a conspiracy charge, in the sense that I think I can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, right?
Yeah.
We don't know that. Maybe so, maybe not. But the key thing here is that Mueller never came out and said there was no conspiracy, right?
Yeah, he says in the report, and I have that section right here. I'm glad you mentioned that, because he reports how some people pleaded the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, so he didn't get that. Some refused to testify. Trump himself wouldn't, even the written questions were only about one aspect of...
Yeah, very incomplete answers.
And so Mueller writes in the report, while this report embodies factual and legal determinations that the office believes to be accurate and complete to the greatest extent possible, given these identified gaps, the people who didn't testify, documents that were overseas somewhere,
Right.
the office cannot rule out the possibility that the unavailable information would shed additional light on or cast in a new light the events described in the report. So he's kind of saying we just didn't have enough, we weren't able to collect enough evidence.
Right.
So
No, that's exactly right. And some of that, and look, it's totally legitimate for somebody to plead the Fifth, right? That's that they're allowed to do. There's other stuff going on here.
That's why we have a Fifth Amendment.
There's other stuff going on that may amount to obstruction of justice, which would be a crime, which also would have deprived them of additional information, right? So in the end, we just can't say if they had actually did have complete information, what kind of charges that might have supported. But with the information available, there wasn't enough to be able to say, I think I can prove conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt.
And this would be conspiracy to commit what crime? What is the underlying crime that we're talking about?
Could be different kinds of crimes, but the main underlying crimes have to do with violations of U.S. election laws. For example, a candidate for office cannot accept a thing of value from a foreigner, right? Or at least not without disclosing it. And I don't think you can do it at all. So some people have argued that if there actually was an agreement between the Trump campaign and the Russians regarding the timing of the release of the emails that they had stolen from the DMC server, that would have actually been providing a thing of value to the Trump campaign. And if there was any coordination or agreement on the timing of that, that would support federal criminal charges for conspiracy. But they didn't find that at least sufficient information of that to be able to say, yeah, I think I could prove this in a criminal sense.
Yeah. So even with these 100+ contacts, there was insufficient evidence to
Right. I mean, proving conspiracy is hard.
Yeah.
Absent the situation where you have a written agreement between two people, right? When you're trying to persuade, if you think about trying to persuade a jury that there was an agreement where there's no direct evidence of an agreement, you got to piece together a lot of circumstantial information. And there is a lot of circumstantial information in the report, right? That is at least suggestive of a possible agreement, right? But the judgment that Mueller had to make is, I think, is it enough that I could sort of prove it in a criminal trial?
Yeah. What is clear in the report, I think, is that the Trump campaign welcomed this kind of interference and help.
Sure.
And certainly didn't raise any alarms about it.
Trump came out and said, hey, Russia, if you're listening, I'd like to see those emails, right?
So, yes, that's right. We'll forget that. So what in this report, since Mueller couldn't come up to a prosecutorial decision, but he does say that there's a lot more out there that apparently can be investigated. Is he trying to tell Congress, go investigate further?
Potentially, right? Also, so I think let's turn here maybe to talk a little bit more about the obstruction of justice.
Okay.
Right? Because his approach on obstruction of justice is actually quite different than his approach on conspiracy.
Okay.
Right? On conspiracy, he basically says, there's not enough evidence here to support a charge of conspiracy. On obstruction of justice, he says, if I thought there wasn't enough evidence to support a charge of obstruction of justice, I would say that. But I'm not saying that.
That's right.
Now, he also doesn't come out and say, I think there is enough evidence to support an obstruction of justice charge. He just ducks that question, right? And he explains why he ducks that question. He ducks that question because ultimately he does not have the authority to charge a sitting president with a crime. And so what he says is effectively, if I did charge him with obstruction of justice, since there is no forum in which to bring a criminal proceeding, there's no forum in which he can really defend himself.
Right.
And it would be unfair to him for me to come out and say, I think there's enough evidence here to support an obstruction of justice charge, when there's no forum in which a criminal trial could go forward at this point in time against the sitting president, right?
And let's talk about this a minute, because this is not based on any precedent. This idea that you cannot prosecute a sitting president, it hasn't been tested in any courts or anything, because no one's ever tried to indict a sitting president.
Right. So it has not been, the Supreme Court has not ruled on this, but the most authoritative office within the executive branch for ruling on these questions is the Office of Legal Counsel within the Department of Justice. And there's precedent from the Office of Legal Counsel, which is considered binding within the executive branch. And this goes back to the 1970s, saying that you can't indict a sitting president. And the reason for this is that the Justice Department is an agency of the executive branch. The president is the head of the executive branch. And this has to do with the notion of all power within the executive branch is subordinate to the power of the president. So therefore, nobody within the executive branch can bring criminal charges against the president, okay? Now, the background on this is interesting and it's important here, right?
Okay.
That under Nixon, that memo was adopted sort of shortly after Watergate, right? But in the Watergate era, the Attorney General appointed Archibald Cox as special counsel to investigate potential crimes related to the Watergate break-in. And when Archibald Cox sort of started getting too close for comfort, Nixon told the Attorney General to fire him. And the Attorney General said no, and the Deputy Attorney General said no. They both got fired. This is known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Yeah. And finally, Robert Bork, who was number 3 in the Justice Department, ended up firing Archibald Cox. He could do that because Cox was a subordinate official within the Justice Department. So Congress's response to this was to adopt legislation a couple of years later called the Ethics in Government Act, which created what they called an independent counsel. And the independent counsel is somebody who is actually outside the executive branch, who's vested with authority under congressional statute to investigate and potentially bring criminal charges against the president. You can also charge other people, right? It's not just the president. But part of the idea is we need somebody outside the executive branch who's not subordinate to the president, who can investigate presidential wrongdoing. So Ken Starr was appointed under this statute to investigate Bill Clinton. Now,
appointed by Congress?
No, appointed by actually special sort of committee of judges that is created under this statute to carry out this function. Okay, so Congress basically under the statute said, since we want to take it outside the executive branch, and it's not necessarily appropriate for Congress themselves to appoint somebody.
Judicial branch, please help us out here.
There's this committee of judges that has the authority to appoint this independent counsel.
Okay.
So they appointed Ken Starr. They appointed others too, but they appointed Ken Starr. Ken Starr investigated Clinton. At least in theory under the statute, Ken Starr could have prosecuted Bill Clinton.
Could have issued an indictment.
Whether that would have been constitutional, we don't know. But he's not covered by this Department of Justice memo that says nobody within the Department of Justice can do it, right? He's outside of that. So he could have chosen said to refer it to Congress, and Congress brought impeachment proceedings, right? Then after that, people decided, well, we didn't like it under Nixon where we had a subordinate official responsible, but we didn't like it under Clinton where this guy has too much independent power.
Independence.
So they let that law lapse, which means that Mueller is appointed under the old system where he is a subordinate official within the Department of Justice. Yeah. He is, therefore is bound by this memo from the Office of Legal Counsel, which says you do not have the authority to prosecute a sitting president, right? So that's the orders he's operating under.
That's a really clear explanation. Thank you. I finally feel like I understand the difference between independent and special counsel. Well, we're on the obstruction part, so let's continue on with that. There was this letter signed by over 1,000 former federal prosecutors, where they come out and say that each of us believes that the conduct of President Trump described in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report would, in the case of any other person not covered by the Office of Legal Counsel policy against indicting a sitting president, result in multiple felony charges for obstruction of justice. You agree with that? From your reading of it?
I think the evidence is pretty compelling in support of that.
Do you want to talk about a couple of the specifics in the report where this would apply?
Yeah, well, I'll refer to actually the statement from the former prosecutors, because I think they do a good job of summarizing the information.
They have three broad areas here.
Exactly, right. So they say one category here is attempts to fire Mueller and then create false evidence, right? And here, basically, Donald Trump asked certain subordinate executive officials to fire Mueller. They refused to do so. And then he tried to cover up, or at least this is what it says in the report, tried to sort of cover up the fact that he had asked them to fire Mueller.
Yeah,
right?
when the New York Times got wind of his asking them, these people, to fire Mueller, he wanted something on the record to say, oh, he didn't ask me to do that.
Yeah, and this is pretty similar to what led to charges in the articles of impeachment that were drawn up against President Nixon that accused him of obstruction of justice, right? So very similar kind of conduct here. Now, the second category is various ways to try to limit the Mueller investigation, right? And there was a lot of back and forth between the White House and the Justice Department. The Justice Department mostly resisted attempts from the White House to sort of interfere with or limit the investigation. They saw that as inappropriate. You know, traditionally, the way the Justice Department works is when a prosecution is going on, the White House simply doesn't meddle. This is up to the Justice Department to do on a purely non-political basis, right? So at least the tradition within the United States is that, you know, investigations leading to potential prosecutions are a matter that is not subject to politics, but is handled in a professional way by a professional cadre of attorneys. And there were various things going on in communications between the White House and the Justice Department where it looks like the White House was trying to meddle in this, and mostly the Justice Department resisted those efforts. Nevertheless, that could support an obstruction of justice charge, right?
Trying to get him, he wanted Sessions to unrecuse himself and then just focus the investigation going forward, not to look back at 2016.
Right. Yeah, which was sort of very different than the sort of terms that you know, that had been laid out in the initial charge to Mueller, which was to go back and look at 2016.
Yeah.
So there's that, and then there's various things that they put under the category of witness tampering and intimidation, right, where Trump is giving instructions to certain people, or maybe not directly, but people who are working directly for Trump are giving instructions to witnesses about, you know, how they should or shouldn't testify, what they should say, what they shouldn't say, right? So all of this looks like pretty strong evidence for various types of obstruction of justice charges against the president himself, right? Not just against subordinate officials within the executive branch, but against the president himself. And one of the things that is really important here is that memo from the Office of Legal Counsel, which has been through a couple of iterations. It's been updated since the original one in the 1970s. Does state pretty clearly that none of this precludes prosecuting a president once he's left office, right? His immunity from prosecution basically lasts as long as he's president. So one of the implications of this letter from the former federal prosecutors is Trump might very well face criminal charges for obstruction of justice once he is no longer president. Now, obviously, there's a big political calculation there about whether you want to do that, but there doesn't seem to be a significant legal impediment if, you know, we get a Democratic president elected in 2020, they could have the authority to, or the Justice Department under that Democratic president could have the authority to bring these kinds of charges against then former President Trump.
And states can bring charges.
Well, again, not while he's president, right? So yes, states could go after him for stuff that he did before he was president. They generally can't go after him for anything he does while he's president, right? That's sort of left to the federal government. Interesting question whether once he's no longer president, states could bring charges for stuff that he did while he was president. I think that's unclear. My guess would be that might be thrown out on constitutional grounds, that this is a federal matter, not a state matter. But he's certainly vulnerable to a variety of charges related to his taxes, related to sexual misconduct that happened before he was president, that certainly state courts would have jurisdiction over that kind of stuff.
I want to follow up on this prosecution after he leaves office, and this is probably why he's been talking about serving additional terms, you know, postponing the inevitable. But some of the Democratic candidates for president were asked about this. I think the first one who was asked was Kamala Harris. She was a former attorney general.
Right.
And it almost sounded like she said, yeah, I would have my Justice Department indict him. That seems to be stepping over that separation line of, you know, it seems to be political pressure on her future Justice Department to bring these charges. Is that an appropriate thing for presidential candidates to even be discussing at this point, and especially in those terms?
I actually didn't realize she had said that. I'm a little surprised by that. I'd want to look carefully at what she said. I'd be less surprised if what she said was, I would have my Justice Department investigate him for bringing possible charges, right? To come out and say, I would have him indict him is a little bit stronger and maybe sort of overstepping the bounds, because that's making a judgment about the sort of quantity and quality of evidence out there. I suspect she's looked pretty carefully at the Mueller report, but I still think that actually if she is elected president and she does come in, she would want to have her own Justice Department look carefully at the evidence before deciding whether or not to bring charges and what kind of charges to bring.
Yeah.
One other thing to point out here, 'cause I think it's very much a political calculation. When Obama came in, there was a lot of consideration of charging senior officials under the Bush administration for allegations of torture that occurred in Guantanamo, that occurred in Iraq, etc. And ultimately, President Obama himself made the call that he did not want to bring those charges, not because he didn't think there was evidence there to support it, but because he thought that politically it was not a good thing to do. It would look bad. It would look like a partisan thing, right?
Right.
And so that would be a calculation that a future Democratic president would have to make, is does this look too partisan? Does it just sort of look bad to do this?
Does it look like revenge?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about what we might expect or not expect Mueller to say when he goes before Congress on, in just a couple of weeks.
Right.
On the 17th, I believe it is. He has already. It's clear he doesn't want to go testify. And then he wanted to do it privately, and now he's responding to a subpoena officially, is he not?
Well, I don't think the subpoena was ever issued, but it was clear that there would be a subpoena issued if he didn't agree to testify. And so he sort of agreed under pressure of, if you don't agree, we're going to issue this subpoena.
So it's clear the Democrats have been kind of waiting first on the report and now on his testimony to kind of blow this whole thing open.
Right.
I get the impression that's not going to happen with Robert Mueller.
I agree with you on that.
He held that press conference where he said, basically, the report speaks for itself, I think were his words.
Right, right.
He was saying he's not going to go beyond what was in the report.
Right. And so I expect him to stick with that when he goes up and testifies before Congress. They will press him. He will start with the position that he said during the press conference that, look, everything I had to say I put into the report. If you want to know what I think, read the report, right? But, you know, the Democratic side, as you pointed out, the Republicans have a different agenda here. Yeah. But the Democratic side of the aisle will be pushing him to say more, right? And there are a couple things that I think they might be able to get out of him, right?
Okay.
So one is, you know, I think he's willing to read certain statements from the report, right, and essentially quote himself. And the things that he chooses to read and quote, what he chooses to read and what he doesn't choose to read is significant, right? So during the press conference, he didn't exactly quote himself, but he sort of paraphrased a statement from the report, which I referred to earlier, which said, if I had thought there wasn't enough evidence to support an obstruction of justice charge, I would have said so, right? Okay. I think he'll be comfortable repeating a line like that. And that's basically a sort of a backdoor way of saying, I think there probably is enough evidence here to support an obstruction of justice charge, but I'm not going to come out and say that explicitly.
Because he's still restricted, even though he's no longer with the Department of Justice, ethically he's still kind of under the control of, you can't talk about he's indictable because Trump still has no arena for defense in that situation.
And this is, you know, you may agree or disagree with that judgment. It's not a legally required judgment, right? So as a legal matter, he could have reached a conclusion that said, I think there's enough evidence here to support an obstruction of justice charge, if he really thought that, right? Which I think he did. His decision not to say that was very much guided by his own personal sense of what's appropriate here in this context where it really isn't possible to go forward with a criminal proceeding, right? And so I don't see him changing his position on that. I think that was guided by his own sense of propriety, and I don't think he's going to deviate from that, right? Now, the other thing that I would expect the Democrats to sort of push him on, and this will be interesting to see, is there was this very interesting exchange that we referred to earlier, which is before the Mueller report was released publicly, Attorney General Barr came out with his summary, right? Then Robert Mueller sends him a memo just a couple of days later that effectively says, I don't really agree with your summary, right?
Right.
Now, that wasn't released immediately. That didn't become public until several weeks later, right? And so if I were on the Democratic side here, I would sort of point to what he said in that memo and say, tell us more about what this means, right? Where you said, and I can't quote it exactly, but...
I do have the quote here.
Okay.
that he said in Barr that Barr's summary letter to Congress, quote, did not fully capture the content, nature, and substance of this office's work and conclusions, end quote. Is that the
Yeah,
quote
that's the line. That's the line. And so I would expect them
that
to sort
gives
of
Congress
press
an
him
opening
on
to follow
that,
it.
right? And say, tell us more about what you meant by that,
Yeah.
right? And it'll be interesting to see how he responds to that, right?
Context, nature, and substances, those are very broad areas.
Right. But essentially, essentially what he's saying there, without saying it directly, is I think that the Attorney General misrepresented what was there in the report, right? And he doesn't want to come out and say that. I wouldn't expect him. I mean, he's a very cautious guy.
Yeah.
That's his nature. That's who he is. I wouldn't expect him to come out and say, hey, Attorney General Barr misrepresented the report, right? I'll say that, but but I don't think he would say that.
Yeah.
I could see them sort of dancing around that issue, and it'll be interesting to see how far he's willing to go in addressing questions on that.
And then finally, for trying to anticipate what his testimony might be, both in the report and in his brief press conference that he gave a while ago, he talked about Congress has the authority and the power to remedy, especially obstruction of justice.
Right.
Do you think he will find a way to re-deliver that message in his testimony? And is that what he's trying to say? Is like, Congress, I didn't come to these conclusions. I gave you this evidence for you to come to these conclusions. And the remedy that clearly he's talking about is impeachment.
Exactly. And that is the clearest remedy under the Constitution for presidential wrongdoing.
It is why it's in there, right?
Right, is that, other people are impeachable too, but this is really the only thing that's there to cover wrongdoing by a president, right?
Yeah.
Is impeachment. I think Robert Mueller will be very, very comfortable saying, you have the power to do this. I think he will be very comfortable saying, I've given you a lot of evidence to work with in thinking about whether you want to go ahead with this. I'd be very surprised if he came out and said, I think you should initiate impeachment proceedings against the president, right? Again, that would be pretty out of character for him to say that. And at this point, my reading of the situation is the sort of push for impeachment. Speaker Pelosi has been pretty successful in tamping that down, right? And in sort of brushing that aside. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of momentum in favor of impeachment. Now, maybe the Mueller testimony...
People each week coming out and saying, I think we're up to 80 Democrats now.
Okay.
But it has not been a stampede or floodgates open at this point.
Right. So, it's possible that he could say something during this testimony that would all of a sudden get another 50 Democrats to line up in favor of, I think we should, bring impeachment proceedings, right?
Right.
I'd be surprised, but I don't know. We'll see.
And I want to get to our audience and bring them into this, but while we're talking about Congress, you had mentioned in our conversations before the program that you wanted to be sure to talk about a couple of bills that are in Congress right now that are kind of related to this whole investigation. So why don't we do that right now? There's
if we go back to the way Mueller laid out his findings about Russian interference, right? There's the sort of hacking and dumping piece, which really relates to election security. And the House just passed a bill that specifically addresses election security. In fact, Zoe Lofgren, who's my representative from San Jose, is the lead sponsor of that legislation. It's called the SAFE Act. This passed the House just a few days ago.
Securing America's...
there's a long title, and the acronym is the SAFE Act.
Securing America's Federal Elections Act, SAFE Act.
Thank you. Okay.
When I first searched the search engine for Congress on this, there have been 50 SAFE Acts over the last 10 or 15 years.
It's a good acronym. Right?
Yes.
So they're trying to put pressure on McConnell to bring some version of this to a floor vote in the Senate. And so far, McConnell is saying, no, I won't do it. It'll be interesting to see whether the Democrats can find a way to sort of embarrass him enough that he would agree to put it before the Senate for a vote. But I'm not banking a lot of money on that.
Not given McConnell's history.
Right.
And in the House, it passed 225 to 184. One Republican
right. Only one
for it.
Republican voted in favor. Right. Which is, you know, frankly, the position of the Republicans on this, to me, is pretty shocking, because what we're trying to do here is basically make sure that votes get counted properly, right? That's fundamentally what this legislation is about, is make sure that votes get counted properly. And the idea that some people are opposed to that is, frankly, pretty shocking, right? But the Republican Party apparently is not in favor of that, at least at this point in time.
Yeah, the Republican Party is apparently not in favor of people casting ballots to be counted in the first place.
Well, that's a separate issue.
That's a whole other program. And then there's the Honest Ads Act.
Right. So the Honest Ads Act was one of actually the last pieces of legislation that Senator McCain sponsored before he died. And it's been reintroduced in this Senate by Senators Klobuchar and Warner, who were McCain's co-sponsors initially. And essentially this deals with paid political advertising on social media. So we have legislation out there that governs paid political advertising by foreigners for other types of media, right? But it doesn't cover social media. It covers basically newspapers, broadcast TV, cable TV, right? But it doesn't cover social media.
So the nature of the outlet is defined in the law, is it?
Yes, the types of media that are covered are actually specified in the existing legislation.
And any legislation written 5 years or more ago is missing out on a lot
Right, this goes back to 2002.
Yeah.
So in 2002, nobody was thinking about social media, right? So the idea of this legislation is essentially to take the existing rules and apply them to social media. But it only covers paid political advertising. And the most influential part of the Russian social media campaign is really what's referred to as organic posting, which is all the stuff that they did on social media that didn't involve paid political advertising. And there's basically nothing that has been done in terms of introducing legislation to address that problem. It's a really hard problem to deal with. So I'm thinking about it. I've got some ideas. Other people are thinking about it. They've got some ideas. I'm talking to some people in Congress to see if I can get somebody to sponsor some legislation like this. But to the best of my knowledge, there are no bills that have yet been introduced that make a serious effort to address that problem. But it is a really hard problem to deal with.
Yeah, you kind of run into First Amendment issues there.
Exactly.
I would think. So just so everybody has this, in the House, the Honest Ads Act is H.R. 2592. There are currently 31 co-sponsors on it, none of them from our area, so you might contact your representative's office and ask them to sign on. It helps move the bill along. And in the Senate, it's S. 1356, and in addition to Amy Klobuchar and Mark Warner, I noticed Lindsey Graham is a co-sponsor of this.
Yes.
That's interesting.
He was not in the original bill, but I suspect because of his very close relationship with John McCain, they reached out to him and said, hey, this was one of McCain's babies, you know, would you sign up to it?
Yeah, and then he'll probably vote against it. All right, let's turn to our studio audience. Just hold up your hand if you have a question. Wait for Julia to arrive with a microphone. And if you would stand up so our camera people can get you on.
Hi, I'm Ken. What is your response to Noam Chomsky's position that the Democratic Party establishment, by going after Trump over Russiagate, instead of bigger issues like nuclear arms proliferation or climate crisis, may well end up facilitating his re-election next year?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think that's wrong. I mean, I think this is a really important issue, and it's an issue that merits attention. There's some interesting public opinion polling data that I saw recently. That in the poll they asked people, what do you think are the sort of most critical threats facing the United States today? I don't remember exactly how the question was phrased, but it's something along those lines. And they listed about 10 of them, and they asked people to sort of identify the ones that they thought were most important, they thought rose to the level of a critical threat or whatever the term was. Among Democrats, so this is public opinion polling, among Democrats, Russian election interference was number one. 70% of Democrats saw this as a critically important issue, ahead of everything else, ahead of terrorism, ahead of other stuff, right? 70% of Democrats, 19% of Republicans thought it was a really important issue. Huge gap here in terms of your political affiliation. But I really do think this is an important issue. I'm not sure I'd put it number one ahead of all the other issues out there, but I think it's a really important issue because it goes to the heart of, do we have a functioning democracy in this country, right? And that is what this country is built on. And if we don't have a functioning democracy, we're in trouble. So I disagree with Chomsky on this. I have great respect for him. I agree with him on a lot of stuff. But I do think it's important to go after this. And I don't know what the consequences will be for the next election. I think it's hard to predict that.
And also, the House is continuing to pass substantial legislation. It's just not even getting taken up in the Senate. It gets over there into Mitch's Death Valley, and the bills are never seen again.
Not on this set of issues.
Yes, that's right. Okay, who's next?
Hello. So I was thinking about
Keep the mic up there.
What does Russian interference look like? And so I'm seeing posts that are forwarded by friends, and it's like it comes out right after the debate yesterday, and it's about how Kamala Harris was a big lock 'em up fan when it comes to marijuana lawbreakers, and she didn't even want to let them out after the law changed. And I'm like, so they're forwarding stuff from people I never heard of. Could that be Russian interference, or is it just really what she did?
This is one of the problems, isn't it? We don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I can say that when she was a prosecutor, she was generally a tough-on-crime prosecutor, which you sort of have to be as a prosecutor if you want to get reelected, right? She is trying to walk away from that record a little bit now in her presidential campaign. So I can't address the specifics of what was her position on sort of imprisonment of people for marijuana. I just don't know the answer to that. But I think the question you raises a sort of a more troubling, broader issue, right? Which is with stuff on social media these days, we don't know where it's coming from, right? So one of the things that Mueller talks about, if you dig into the Mueller report, there's all kinds of interesting tidbits in there with examples of sort of what the Russians were doing, right? But one of them that I thought was particularly interesting is the Russians actually organized a pro-Trump rally in Tennessee in the weeks before the election, right? They set up this page, I can't remember whether it was Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, but whatever, right? They set up a social media account that pretended to be the sort of, Tennessee branch of the Trump campaign. And they put out stuff to all sorts of people, come to this rally at this place on this time and this date. We're going to have a big pro-Trump rally. Everybody come out and show your support, right? But it was a Russian-operated account doing that. And they actually got lots of people to come show up for the rally. And one of the things that Mueller looks at in his investigation was there actually coordination between the Trump campaign and this Russian operation? And they found insufficient evidence of coordination in that particular instance. This was not the only one where they actually organized a rally, but it was, I think, the biggest rally that they were able to organize.
Okay, another question in the back row.
Well, following up on the point Tien raised, I think it was Sunday's New York Times talked about this Republican operative who is connected to the Trump reelection campaign. Well, you could say more about it, but his Joe Biden and other scary things you didn't want to believe were true about Democratic candidates, social media influence campaigns. And he's an American, and it actually says, not I'm working for the Republican Party, but I'm not a Russian, basically. So you can believe what I'm telling you.
Right. Yeah, although the tactics he employed are very similar to some of what the Russians were up to, right? So now political operatives in this country, and it's not just the Republicans, the Democrats have done some stuff like this too, right? They've learned from the Russian playbook, and they're getting better at doing this disinformation stuff, right? But if we know who's doing it, what I can say sort of as a matter of constitutional law is the Constitution generally doesn't protect the First Amendment rights of Russians who are sitting over in Moscow, like typing stuff into their keyboards, right? But the First Amendment does protect the constitutional rights of Americans who are, sitting wherever they are in the United States typing stuff into their keyboards, right? And so it makes it very difficult to sort of get at this stuff in a way that's actually effective because we don't know up front who's Russian, who's not, right? And it's a hard problem.
Yeah, on the internet, no one knows if you're a Russian or not.
Right.
Okay, any more questions in the audience here? Okay, up front. And, all righty, thank you.
Yes, I'm Lawrence. So it's not an act of war, what Russia did, but it's pretty damn serious. If they wouldn't allow certain products to come in, they blocked oil coming into the United States, we would react. So what could be the reaction to influencing, maybe possibly helping to steal a presidential election?
Yeah, so the United States has already taken certain countermeasures in the form of cyber warfare. So for example, we did a cyber attack. The main Russian organization that was responsible for the social media campaign is called the Internet Research Agency. It's officially not a part of the Russian government, although clearly they're operating very much in collaboration with the Russian government. We know where the Russian government, where the Internet Research Agency is based. We've been able to pinpoint the building that they're operating out of. The U.S. conducted a cyber attack on that building and basically took out all power in the building and knocked out all the computers in the building. This happened like a couple of months ago as a reprisal against the Russians for what they were doing in their sort of social media campaign, right? So, when President Trump decided not to drop a bomb on Iran, instead he sort of launched a cyber attack on Iran, right? So we may well see a lot more of that kind of stuff going on, which, is a way of engaging in, what I like to think of as sort of information warfare or cyber warfare, which is below the threshold of armed conflict, which would trigger application of the laws of war and gets you into all sorts of other stuff, right? At least at the moment, none of this is covered by the laws of war. None of this is considered armed conflict, right? But we have this whole category of sort of low-level conflict going on under the nature of cyber warfare. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this, and there are a variety of things that the U.S. can do offensively. The big difference is, right, we can't interfere in their democratic electoral process because they don't have a democratic electoral process, right? So we can't hit back at them that way, so we got to find other ways to hit back at them.
Any other audience questions here? We're just a few minutes left. Well, let me follow up with one that I'm confused about from the Mueller report. Sure. And that apparently was, and we do just have a few minutes left, 3, he tells me, that if I read this right, Mueller decided not to bring any charges against Donald Trump Jr. over the Trump Tower meeting,
right?
Because he seemed to be saying that Trump Jr. didn't know the law about reporting this.
Right.
I thought ignorance was no defense. Ignorance of the law is no defense.
In general, ignorance is no defense. There are particular criminal statutes that require the prosecution to prove knowledge of the law as an element of the offense. I'm not really familiar with the details of this, but remember, the version of the Mueller report that we have seen is heavily redacted, and it refers in a number of cases to ongoing investigations. So one of the things that Mueller did was decide to hand off certain things to sort of ordinary federal criminal prosecutors to continue the investigation. And based on what we know, it's certainly entirely possible that a federal prosecutor in New York is continuing to investigate Donald Trump Jr. and could bring charges against Donald Trump Jr., right? So I don't think there's anything in the Mueller report that precludes that. And some of the redacted stuff, at least possibly, could relate to that, although I have no inside information about what's in the redacted part, so I don't know that.
But there are a lot of pieces of the report that are redacted because of continuing investigations.
Because of continuing investigations.
That's one thing that stands out. There's a lot of those, so this isn't over yet.
There's a number out there. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I want to say something like about 13 or 16 ongoing investigations, something like that. That number has been made public. So, yeah, it's not just one or two.
30 seconds. Where does this go from here after Mueller testifies? I always hate to ask people to be prognosticators, but
right.
But I do anyway.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't think the Mueller testimony is going to change a whole lot. I think that it sort of gets him off the hook, which is what he wants. Is he wants to be able to basically go home and have people stop bothering him. It may achieve that, right?
Yeah, he can finally retire.
But I'm not sure it changes a whole lot else. Besides that, I think we're going to continue to see pushes to adopt legislation to respond to Russian interference. And I think some of these ongoing investigations we're going to learn about, and we'll see what other kinds of charges are brought.
Okay. We've been talking with David SLOSS, professor of law at Santa Clara University School of Law. David, thanks so much for joining me here on Other Voices. Thank you all.